Midnight Lands is a Morin Academy podcast about the past, present, and future of Catholicism.
Welcome to another episode of Midnight Lands. For this episode, we're honored to have on Father Nathan Symeon, who's a priest in the Italo-Greek Byzantine Catholic Church, in which he directs religious education and evangelization for his eparchy. He's received a substantial series of degrees and is pursuing his STL at Mundelein. And last but not least, he's a father of five. Would you add anything to that intro or take anything? Is it dated?
I have a podcast too called Searchers of the Lost.
Yeah. How can I leave
I
that
have
out?
not, no, it's all good. I haven't put out episodes for the last few weeks. I'm in the middle of studying for my comprehensives. And so I'm not doing anything on my own pretty much. I'm just like, but I'm willing to talk with people who just want to chat. So I was willing to meet with you today.
Yeah, so I've been listening for a long time, and I kind of wanted to follow up on an interview you put out in March with Dr. Matthew Minard, where the conversation went in one direction, and I was left wanting to learn more about like a fork in the road that wasn't taken.
Okay, sure.
And so that fork in the road you talked about in that interview that you were hoping when you were in the process of formation to becoming an Eastern Catholic priest, you were hoping you would not get caught up in traditionalist problematics. And I think you referred to it as a kind of quasi-Gnostic stage. You thought you could sort of spiritually escape the
Yeah.
crisis in the Latin wing of the church, and you found out that that was not the case. So could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, because, in the Byzantine Church, we're having our own kind of resource mont, if you will, in the sense of, if you look at any of the papal documents concerning our church, it's continually go back to your own faith, go back to your own faith. And one of the things that I experienced when I came to the Byzantine Catholic Church, I came through a group of monks in the Holy Resurrection Monastery under the very recently deceased Abbot Nicholas. And he, of blessed memory, I might add, he instructed me in the faith for the first 6 months of my time as a Byzantine, and it was thoroughly Eastern. So I might even say thoroughly Orthodox. The common phrase used to be, I've suggested I don't really like this phraseology, but for the moment, I'll state, Orthodox in communion with Rome. And so my vision of being Byzantine was just I'm thoroughly Byzantine. That's what I'm entering into. Then when I came into um, uh, the Ruthenian Church, I don't know, gosh, 10 years ago, I immediately noticed that it was not quite like the Holy Resurrection Monastery. It was much more kind of a mixture of Latin and Byzantine. So at my time in the seminary, that was a perpetual frustration of mine that it's just kind of like a mixed thing. So I really just want to focus on my own Eastern tradition. Understandably, I think, if you're a Latin Christian, you really want to focus on being a Latin Christian. And the same goes with our faith. It has a whole integrity of its own. But behold, I entered into the parochial life, and the vast majority of my current parishioners are from the Latin parish at some point in their life. And so the reality of being a Byzantine Catholic priest is that there's no way of escaping that this is a church that has both Latin and Eastern tendencies. And so I've kind of been forced to um, go more deeply into the Latin side of the Universal Church. I'm currently pursuing my STL at Mundelein. I've finished all of my coursework now, and so I've got to go pretty deep into the tradition because it's a degree in dogmatic theology. So I've got to go pretty deep into the Latin tradition now, and so in the midst of doing that, of course, there's a crisis in the Latin Church in particular, and if we could broadly categorize as kind of what we refer to as the traditionalist movement, and then there's let's say that there's kind of a an in-between movement, which is much more palatable than the far left movement. So the far left movement I have very little sympathy with.
Mhm.
Traditionalists and modernists or moderatists I have a lot more sympathy with and I understand a lot more. So I've had to kind of work through some of these quandaries which were not my own. They're not my native landscape. As well as that, of course, I've had to talk with not a few sedevacantists as well.
Okay. And
So it's
what
a
has,
practical part of my ministry now.
sure. And what has that been like to have to wade into specifically the traditionalist versus the centrist, or if we call it the communio school? I think that's kind of what you're talking about, right? Um, yeah, what's that been like for you experientially?
Well, there's good and bad, I think. So um, when we start getting more into the side of the sedevacantism, they start to get polemical against the Orthodox, which just doesn't work for me at all. Like
Mhm.
that's the complete opposite perspective that I'm coming from, right? So that can be very grating because they can try to force their medieval piety or their medieval theology. I won't say piety. I have no problem with their piety. The medieval ecclesiology onto the Byzantine Church because one of the kind of psychological dilemmas that's going on is they're trying to escape from modernism in their own church. They're coming to the Byzantine parishes and they're telling the Byzantine parishes, be be that Latin church that we really want to be in. And you're our second choice. If there were a Latin liturgy near us, we'd go to it, but nevertheless, we want you to be that. And so that of course is a very grating experience and not super easy to deal with, pastorally speaking.
Mhm.
I am to some extent able to deal with it. I have my own methods I've developed along the way, namely not getting in arguments about certain things. As a pastor and not doing academics in that context, I have to approach it quite differently than I would from an academic vantage point. Um, Now, traditionalists, in the sense of persons who want to live a traditional Catholic life, a traditional liturgy, traditional spirituality, traditional dogmatics. That's very easy, and I'm actually that actually looks a lot more orthodox than what I see in a lot of Norvis order churches, which I'm not sure what I'm looking at oftentimes. So I do have a strong sympathy for traditionalists as well.
Yeah. And then you said in that interview with Dr. Minard that one of the things that struck you is that it's traditionalists think that they're recovering like a medieval theology, or I think you used the word piety in the interview, but they don't see that it's actually a kind of modern spirituality, a modern form of Catholicism. Uh,
Yeah,
could you expand a bit more on that?
yeah. So um, there's a hyper focus on, let's say, like now these are none of these pious practices or devotions do I have a problem with per se. Okay, but I just want to kind of point this out. These are going to be medieval and modern developments. So the high focus on the rosary as kind of superseding all other forms of prayer. Um, novenas, wearing of medals, wearing of scapulars, Marian apparition focus. You find this hyper focus among traditionalists. Those are really developed medieval pieties. They're not things that you find in the first 1,000 years of patristic spirituality. Now that doesn't make them false, and I believe that the church is a living tradition that can develop, but it's not. If you mean by traditional conserving the ancient form of Christian spirituality, that would not be the case. That would not be traditional. Those would be relatively modern. So even Aquinas understood himself as doing is something modern. Now that would be leaving the spiritual for the kind of the metaphysical, if you will. But um, if you were to try to have a conservative or traditional form of spirituality, it would be a return to the daily offices as a focus, a return to more Lectio Divina. It would be a greater focus on contemplation. These would all be things that are kind of universally true of both East and West for the first 1,000 years as forms of spirituality. And so sometimes when I'm talking with traditionalists, I realize quite quickly that they're not deeply steeped in the patristic tradition. If they were steeped in the patristic tradition, they would know that. That would be obvious to them. But because they're not primarily reading the fathers, but modern sages and mystics and contemporary devotionals, let's say in the last 200 years, they're convinced that they've actually got the traditional spirituality. They're not realizing at all that it's quite modern if you compare it to the more ancient practices of spirituality.
Mhm. Mhm. And would it be fair to kind of summarize everything you just said there as in a way they want to recover sort of the late Baroque period and that their imagination of what living out Catholicism is, almost like if they had their way, it would be something more like the Spanish Empire
I think so.
than a
I think
return
so.
to the ancient church.
A very dominant pope that's connected directly with political powers
Mhm.
that would oftentimes completely dismiss the Orthodox as heretics, certainly Protestants as heretics, just altogether dismissed all of them. It would want to return to an ecclesiology that affirmed those things. Uh, you'd see a transition in the ecclesiology starting all the way from Lateran 4, where it starts to become more accepting towards others, especially in Thomas Aquinas, accepting of Orthodox in particular. They would probably not be aware of that. They would see the kind of the one church. The one church is the Roman Catholic Church, which is changed in Vatican II, subsists in the Roman Catholic Church. Um, and they would more typically, like recently I had Sedevacantes tell me that Orthodoxy was a different religion. So, like, clearly unaware of the traditional ties, if you actually look at traditional theology between Orthodox and Catholics, from the beginning, there's this kind of like new sense of traditionalism, which is like the elect of the elect, and everyone else is just part of this great Babylonian captivity. There's a great conspiracy theory that you know that everyone else is kind of going to hell and without the sacraments, except for those who ironically don't receive the sacraments um, because they can't find any priest to give them sacraments.
Mhm. Sure, which and this kind of psychology, it's repeated throughout church history, right? Of like the enthusiastic people that they're part of the faithful remnant, and it has its corollary, I think, in the Orthodox world with like the so-called genuine Orthodox, right?
Yes. Yeah,
That
the rebaptismal controversy is another great example of this. The work of Father Peter Heers, the ecclesiastical renovation of the Catholic Church. That work is an example of that kind of that rigorism that it seems more like a neo-Donatism to me, than true Orthodoxy or true Catholicism.
Mhm. Yeah. So could you expand a bit on what this view obviously isn't in vogue in traditional circles. How do they get to be so parochial? Like, how do instead of they try and dig back deeper into the sources, they just say like starting with St. Thomas and then Neo-Thomism and all the Baroque developments afterwards, that's all we need. And instead of questioning that, we just kind of accept that reality, and that's our worldview. And
Well, I mean, I'm speaking as an outsider to some extent, right? So my observation is that for many of the, I'm gonna call them rad trads instead of traditionalists, because I don't think this is like all traditionalists. I'm highly sympathetic towards people who want traditional mass, who want traditional theology and spirituality. But the rad trads seem to universally despise Vatican II. And one of the things that Vatican II tried to do was focus more on kind of a pastoral language than a sophisticated philosophical language to do theology. And so basically Thomism is dismantled at Vatican II in the sense that it's no longer the dominant language, and there's very few neo-Thomists at that point. So it seems to me that the gut reaction is, well, let's just like, well, if that's what they did, since everything they did was wrong, we just need to go back to Thomas, and we need to look at scholastic theology again as the foundation for true theology. So it seems to me that seems to be the direction that they're going in.
right, and blind to earlier in this interview, you said, I think if I heard you right, you were making the argument that St. Thomas, his theology represented a shift from the spiritual to the metaphysical.
Yeah, I think that's what he's interested in doing. I'm not saying that he himself didn't live a holy and spiritual life. I'm saying that in regards to the Summa, that's clearly what his interest is. So, Bonaventure, I think, wrote a lot more broadly than Aquinas. And so he's a more helpful example for me because you can read Bonaventure in one place where, he's just as rigorous, if not more difficult even to understand than Thomas. But then in other places, when he writes mystical theology, he's clearly very interested in mystical theology. Right when he's interested in talking about the life of Francis, he's able to turn into to a biographer and doesn't look like he's a scholastic guy at all. That's because he has different interests in different places. When Thomas wrote his Cantina, he's interested in giving us the teachings of all of the fathers. So different, theologians have different interests at different parts of their lives or for different purposes. We always have to ask the question, what is the purpose of what a theologian is writing for? And so clearly, Thomas, following that of Albert the Great, was writing in the tradition of trying to bring together a florilegium of the fathers to answer questions of that dealt with discoursive thinking. So that's what he was doing, and for that he does an incredible job. But it's just not the same thing as an interest in mystical theology or New Testament scholarship or something like that. So I would say that's more of a just a product of writing in a particular genus of literature.
Mhm. Right, and a method that would come with that. And then the danger for traditionalism is if you like absolutize that method or treat it like it should be the foundation of all the theology that the church does. Instead of what comes up in that interview with Minard several times about actually like mystical theology is the highest form of theology, and scholasticism ultimately, you don't say this, but I think it follows, is like basically a part or a wing of the church and is a valid theology, but it is not the definitive theology.
Right. Well, that's exactly right. I mean, you could produce arguably um, with use AI tools. You could likely, if not now, in a couple of years, we'll be able to do things like the Summa. It doesn't require a human. It doesn't require any interaction with God, in fact. It just requires having the data and being able to use reason to process through that data to come to conclusions. Well, that can't be the highest form of theology. if a computer can do that kind of a theology, and that's what the highest form of theology is, that speaks really lowly about being an image and likeness bearer, right? So there has to be a higher form of theology, which is direct encounter with God. And what Thomas was doing was he was taking the the teachings of the spirit bearing fathers and the Holy Scripture and saying, based on those who have encountered God, um, and what they say about their understanding of God, here are the logical conclusions that we can draw out. So he is implicitly affirming exactly what you and I are saying, that it's not the highest level of theology. And of course, at the end, the famous, you could basically, he affirms that you could burn all of his works up because they're like straw. Well, I would argue that's in comparison to the direct experience of God, which he seems to have had at the end of his life.
Right. And then, I think this came up in one of your interviews with Father Christopher. He talked about at when your guys' time at Nishodo House. He brought up, okay, well, if St. Thomas says at the end of his life his whole work is like burned up straw, then what does it mean if our method is, why are we trying to make a house out of this burned up straw? And he said he was kind of greeted with incomprehension because it's like, well, we make stuff out of straw.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a fair point. That's a fair point.
yeah.
Yeah. I think it could be, really helpful to try to puzzle certain problems with one of the most brilliant minds, right, who's ever lived. That's really helpful for puzzling and for bringing together so many patristic sources in one place and offering us all of those sources at one time. Because one of the dangers in contemporary theology within the kind of Catholic spectrum is, and I find this a lot in a lot of Orthodox writings recently, is there can be a myopic view of the fathers. So, two or three fathers are quoted to the exclusion of, another seven or eight who have a divergent perspective. And they claimed like this is the Orthodox faith. Well, like that's like, and I'm going to say I don't think that's true. I think they're wrong. They're not understanding what the Orthodox faith is, right? Uh, Aquinas wants to include all of the material that he's aware of in the conversation, and he's aware that some of the fathers contradict each other, and he wants to offer us though the best solutions they can come up with all of the divergent material. So I think it's an incredibly important project, and I hope that we keep building on Aquinas project of collecting all of the interpretations of the fathers and doing our best to synthesize those answers, though that's not the same thing as pure theology, as mystical theology, if you will.
Mhm. Because mystical theology is primarily about like the soul's ascent to God.
Exactly. Yeah, it happens in the context of ridding oneself of the vices, um, learning how to pray, encountering God more deeply through the life of prayer and contemplation. And so that's the purest form of theology, and the purest form of prayer is contemplation, mystical theology.
Mhm. Right. Which ultimately has to be like a lifestyle, right? It can't be a kind of disembodied rationalism.
Right. Yeah, it's very human, right? And so I'd even want to say, I think one of the interesting things that AI is going to demonstrate for us in the future, as theologians become less and less important, because AI is able to do, like I did an interview today, and I needed a table of all of the passages from the scripture that teach that the church is the new temple of God and not a physical building. Because I was doing an interview with a Protestant brother, and I was able to put together an entire table in 4 minutes, and I'm not exaggerating, right? But like that would have taken me an hour before AI. So I think what we're going to find is that we can collect data and information without theologians, without interviews, without, having massive resource banks pretty soon because AI is going to be able to pull all that together. And well, what does that, what at the end of the day, what that's going to tell us is like, okay, well, we're made in the image and likeness of God. A machine is able to do this thing. So what is it that truly makes us most human? What is it that really makes one a theologizer of God, one who really is in love with knowing God? What I think what we're gonna see from that is that it's the human heart, the center of our being, the aspect of the human that relates directly with God, that makes us most truly human, and not our intellectual capacities, right? Because no machine's ever going to be able to reproduce the human heart like that.
Mhm. Right. And the capacity to love.
Capacity to love, to be in communion.
Right. And then speaking of communion, could you briefly talk, I can imagine all sorts of, if an Orthodox person or a kind of rigorous Peter Hears or Father Peter Hears, Jay Dyer type was listening, they'd be like, don't you see that all the talk, kind of dismissive talk we were doing a little while ago about St. Thomas and scholasticism is built on straw? Don't you see that this is all because the Latin lung of the church has apostatized? Why in your heart are you still in communion with the Latin Church, and
Okay.
what do you hope if it were to incorporate the limitations of the Thomist and the Baroque tradition and really kind of like faithfully move past Vatican II and the crisis that we're in? Sorry, hopefully that wasn't too big of a question.
Yeah, well, no, I'll stick with the context that we're in. I hope I've been very clear that I don't denounce the scholastic tradition. I completely disagree with that. There's a work, I believe it's by Christos Panagitis. It's called Greek Patristic Theology. And he very thoroughly documents, as numerous books have done, that Byzantine theology is not purely monastic theology, which is really a newfangled form of theology that came out of the Russophile movement and guys like John Romanides. But the Byzantine tradition has always included philosophers. In fact, there are vastly more philosophers in the Byzantine tradition than the Latin tradition, basically until the fall of Constantinople. Before that, the Byzantines were very well equipped in the philosophical tradition. They were writing a lot of philosophical treatises. So um, it's a matter of emphasis. So just because today, like a lot of people don't think about the fact that today does not dictate what it must always be. It was different in the past. There were times when our people were my English and Germanic ancestors were still burning sacrifices to pagans, and the Greeks were already completely developed in their philosophical tradition, right? And that there came a time though when the Greeks fell, right, to Islam, and after the Frankish Empire, we had some reprieve. We had a lot more economic political stability. People were start able to take the time to philosophize, live the good life, do theology, and that's more just an accident of history. It's not. It's so there was a time when the Greeks did more philosophy. There's a time now when the Romans do more philosophy. It seems to be an accident of history. Scholastic theology, one might argue, started with Saint John Damascene, of course, who is Greek. Thomas Aquinas quotes, I think he's the third most quoted in the Summa, because he's trying to follow the theology of Saint John Damascene. He's trying to follow in his path, essentially through a scholastic method. The first two works of John Damascene's Font of Knowledge they're on philosophy, they're on logic, they're on metaphysics. So St. John Damascene believes very clearly that in order to understand the fathers of the church, you need to know metaphysics. So today there's a hyper focus on monastic spirituality within Orthodoxy or the monastic fathers. But we have to remember that there were the Cappadocians, Maximus the Confessor, St. John, Damascene. These guys were all very, very well trained in philosophy, and they used it to explain the Christian faith. So there are different forms of theology, is I guess what I'd like to say. This isn't a dismissal, certainly not a reason to leave communion with the Catholic Church. As I've pointed out in previous podcasts, one simply has to open up a few books of the monastics within the Carthusian, Carmelite, Benedictine tradition, and you'll realize very quickly that it has very common threads, if not absolutely the same threads of thought as Orthodox spirituality and mysticism.
Mhm.
I have found no contradictions in these various forms of spirituality. I would say that there are apparent contradictions that are more plainly the result of different persons speaking in different cultures and therefore giving different ways of expressing their faith. So because of that, it sounds divergent, but in the end, I don't actually find this great divergence of thought.
Right. Contra the Orthodox polemic would be that all of these spiritualities are kind of tending in other directions, and this is papered over by papal supremacy, basically.
Yeah, and that's a narrow read of orthodoxy. Like just like with like rad trads, I wouldn't want to say like rad trads equal Catholics. The same with Orthodox. I wouldn't want to say that this kind of hyper neo-Donatist form of orthodoxy is equal to orthodoxy.
Sure.
I see that as an extreme.
Right.
That I don't think most Orthodox scholars would like that. I don't think like Marcus Plested, for example, has very clearly and more coherently and absolutely condemned that kind of thinking that I have in this current podcast.
Mhm. Mhm. So what pastorally do you have a read at all on like what is it that makes a type of person either, a kind of neo-Donatist Orthodox type or a kind of rad trad, uh, ultra Thomist, whatever we want to call them? Like I guess for me, like I'm a pretty like kind of melancholic, introspective person, and I'm more interested like natively in critiquing or and not just critiquing myself, but like learning more about what I have or what I think and what I'm grounded in than I'm going to get on YouTube and explain, why there's no grace outside of whatever communion I'm a part of. Um, why do you think people are content to stay in their kind of parochial horizons instead of be open?
I think because the traditionalists keep the faith intact. I would much rather, let's say I was going to go, like I would much rather go to um, and in fact I do sometimes go to St. Anthony's Monastery in Arizona, right? Which is known to be very, very fundamentalist in the Orthodox realm, like anti-Catholic, all the rest. I would rather go there if I were a monk than some liberal Orthodox monastery. I don't even know that there is any, but let's imagine one. And the reason is because I know that they're going to keep the tradition. So even if I disagree with their view of other Christians, I know that they're doing their best to preserve that tradition. And so in a society where the the theology keeps shifting, the ecclesiology keeps shifting. It doesn't seem like we're firmly affirming the tradition of the church. It's much safer to be with those who set out as their mission to preserve the faith. And so, for a person like myself, I'm much more inclined towards a traditional experience of God. It's time tested and it produces saints. When you're constantly feeling like you're being shifted by the wind in the contemporary church, and this is true both of Catholics and Orthodox who are experiencing this, um, it becomes a place of escape, and so you can kind of go in your bubble and just look. just like the Maccabees, right? Or the Pharisees. Like, let's just stay here and avoid the Gentiles because they're going to infect us. So that's very appealing to a person who wants that tradition. I think it's also appealing to the kinds of persons that have never felt like they belong. And this is a place that finally tells them you belong, and the other is the enemy. You're the good guy. So there's a kind of embracing that goes on for persons who feel like outcasts, that isolates and insulates them from these external threats.
Mhm. So security and community basically would be you know, it
And
makes a
it, and
lot.
it bolsters your faith.
Mhm.
There's the demonic world and the angelic world, right? The demons are the bad guys, and they're outside of our group, and we're part of the angelic world. And so, what we've got to do is we got to fight. There's like you actually have some substantial enemies who you can fight, and so you have you have a substantial place of holiness too that you can stand for, and you very clearly know that you're on the good side and they're on the bad side. Whereas when you live in the current climate, you're constantly having to, I know that I am, to question myself. Am I on the right side of this thing? Am I on the wrong side of this thing? Like maybe I'm somewhere in the middle. Maybe I have some responsibility. Maybe I'm also responsible for this schism, right? It's a lot less comfortable
Right.
to
Well, and
stay in union with this body that's over a billion persons. I mean, to stay in union with that is not easy. Living in a house with just five daughters is not easy for me, let alone living in a communion of a billion people. That's a really hard thing to preserve unity in the context of.
Mhm. Right. And it seems to me like, I don't know, ecclesiologically might not be quite the right word, but let's run with it. It seems like that's a better, like, kind of desert experience to be like, I'm out, I'm exposed to the world. In this case, it's like the church and whatever's going on in the heads and hearts of a billion members. That's better. In a way, it's a more authentic openness to the church and ultimately perhaps to God than, we have our narrow tradition and we feel safe and warm and snuggled. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
but you want to, yeah. But then where it's tough is on the other side of things. If I'm imagining, like a left liberal, progressive, concilium type of Catholic, they could affirm everything I just said because they would say, well, yeah, we're radically open. Um, and so it's like, how do you rightly divide uh, being a faithful member of the church? I think. I think.
Well, I think that's the sweet spot that's hard to get, right? Which is like, and the most common reality that most pastors experience on the daily, and um, probably leads most of us pastors, Orthodox or Catholic, um, to be a little bit more open to others, is that when people come to us for pastoral direction, um, they're not whole persons, right? They're not like, in other words, they don't have all of their theology down. They're not living a perfect spiritual life. They don't understand like what orthodoxy is. They're oftentimes quite broken. And if you think that you need to make them perfect before you can work on them, it makes the task impossible. And so you realize quite quickly, I have to kind of accept people where they're at, and then work in the areas of their life that I think God is working on, and take this thing slowly, So you realize that quickly as a pastor. You might not realize that as a layperson, because as a layperson, it's not your job to fix everybody. So if someone seems broken to you, you can just go, all right, well, have a good life. See you later. You and I don't agree on this issue. As a pastor, you can't do that. So since you can't do that, you're forced into doing it. And once you do it enough, you start to realize like this human experience that we're having with one another isn't purely dependent on how orthodox a person is. Oftentimes people can be thoroughly orthodox and the biggest pains in the butts because they're psychologically incredibly immature, or they use orthodoxy as a weapon, instead of as a means to grow in Christ. Whereas you can get someone who comes in who's lib, but has a good heart for God, and they're a lot easier to work with. You can help restore them much more easily than the person who's a fundamentalist and kind of broken on the inside.
Mhm. Right. And then enter the Augustinian tradition that we will be surprised who gets into heaven and who gets into hell. That there is a sense in which there is a layer in which the church is invisible because we can't ultimately know people's hearts, and all sorts of things that superficially are happening are concealing these like profounder realities.
That's right. That's right. And it doesn't prohibit us, by the way, from correcting people. So
Mhm.
that's where like the liberal strand doesn't work at all, right? It's just kind of like come be whoever you want. But there's kind of a middle of the line perspective, which is like, no, we still affirm orthodoxy, but we recognize that humans are broken. And so we'll slowly draw you into the fullness of the Orthodox expressions of the Orthodox theology. But it's a process. It's not something that you use to bang people over the heads with.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and then enter, I think, one of perhaps it's peculiarly modern, and perhaps it's not, but part of me thinks that to some extent, especially I've kind of seen it in Catholicism, but I suspect it's happening on the kind of neo-Donatist Orthodox side, as we're calling it, is there's this kind of reverse clericalism where like lay people are kind of taking prerogatives that really belong to the clergy, like trying to say how liturgy should happen, or saying pastorally, we don't think the discipline the church is imposing is right. Um, yeah,
And that's happening both in Catholic and Orthodox circles.
sure,
Yeah, I
sure.
mean, this is a major problem. I was just talking to priests the other day in the Catholic Church who were saying, the lay apostolates online are problematic because they oftentimes are driven by their fans, and they don't
Mhm.
listen to the priests. So the more numbers they get, the more they're sure that they're doing the right thing. Meanwhile, the clergy are all going, "Yeah, can you please stop? That's not what we're trying to do. That's not the direction of the magisterium." Like hyper polemics against orthodoxy is not at all the direction of the magisterium. So when you find that kind of thing, I mean, who's their pastor? I feel bad for them because likely their pastor is going, "Can you please knock it off? That's not what I want." And I think that the same thing to a lesser extent can be said about orthodoxy. That oftentimes I talk with Orthodox priests who most certainly do not affirm the type of polemics that exist online.
Mhm.
So it is a real problem today. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess it's just to some extent it just has to be our cross to bear that if all of this, we're on one podcast here, you have another one, and we're all kind of glued together by algorithms and economic incentives. I mean, not so much you or me, but yeah, and it's always going to be more appealing. I've become a little bit of like a kind of fatalist elitist about a lot of things that like I feel like in this world it's like 80% of people are going to always be way more attracted to this is why excommunion, the one argument that destroys whatever is always going to be more appealing than listening to you or me or Dr. Miner talk about what are the limitations of the scholastic method and, what are the seeds that in
Right, right.
a thousand years could lead to reunion. Um, yeah, and maybe fatalism isn't quite the right word, but I guess I view it as like adulting. Um,
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. Yeah, the passions are always more attracted to immediate results.
mhm.
So,
Right. And they're always more gratifying at a fleshly level.
right, exactly. You can say like, "Oh man, that guy got his butt kicked." Like, we love that. That's really fun. I had one of my friends who's a polemicist for the Orthodox Church. I was talking and I said, why do people love this stuff? And he said it's the equivalent of a boxing match.
Hmm.
It's the equivalent of a boxing match. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for the blood and guts, and that's what they want to see happen.
Yeah.
So what do you do with that?
What do
What
you,
do you
because part of
do
me is
with
like,
that?
man, just watch boxing matches. Like, why do we have
Right.
to the Filioque
Yeah.
way? Uh, what kind of weird, perverted situation is this? But I guess that's fallen human condition,
Well,
right?
I think what's appealing about it is they get to enter into the boxing match. So, people who would not generally get in fistfights or argue publicly get to get in there and punch somebody verbally um, in a way that they can't actually do in the real world, and that's tempting for them. They want to be part of the match, right? It's like football fans, right? They would love to get in there and like actually play football, but they can't. So instead, they get behind their team and they yell at the other fans, and they even get in fights. And even heard about people getting shot, right? I think there's something equivalent that happens here.
Mhm. Yeah, where it's just and again, a classic, what was it? Like one of the the greens and the reds and the hippodrome in Constantinople, right?
What is that? The greens and the reds.
I mean, I would have to look it up. This is the greens and the reds. Let me double check this. But I think they were associated with like orthodoxy versus
Did they actually wear colors or something?
I believe so, yeah. And it's like some
Wow.
people trace it to the origins of like both political parties. Okay, so it's blues. This is just the Wikipedia article.
Okay.
Blues and greens in the Byzantine Empire. They were the dominant two of the four demes. Beginning in the days of Augustus, as chariot racing factions, the color divisions gradually covered other aspects of daily life, such as the theater, and by the 5th century, they had become more akin to political parties. Between the 5th and 8th century, the Demes grew so powerful that they participated in the political and religious conflicts of the time, terrorized the city with their frequent riots, had their own official militias, made and unmade emperors, and were sometimes called on by the emperors for tasks like repelling invasions and repairing the city walls. Um, and then, yeah, so we don't have to get too into it, but Christological controversies intersected at some points.
Interesting. Yeah, they were like the Crips and Bloods back then
Yeah, basically.
of the theology world.
Yeah. Orthobro, Crips and Bloods. So,
Yeah, that's true. I mean, maybe they just should all get in a boxing ring and just have a fight and call it a day, if that's
right.
what they're really looking for. They might find life more satisfying
Yeah.
than just getting in living in the computer world, living in the fictitious worlds of computer where you don't actually. One of the things I don't do, like I don't respond to people like on my if people respond on my podcast, I don't respond to them if they start the name calling or if they're inflammatory towards someone that I bring on. I don't respond to them at all. Because that's what they're looking for. They want to drag me into it. But that's what I think is going on. But like I said, I've actually had Catholics tell me that I'm excommunicated.
Really?
So yeah, they
Which
don't even need a
means
bishop.
they,
They can just tell me. They know. So
yeah. Yep. That's the world we live in. But so I guess let's end this on a bit more positive note. I guess what gives you, especially as we're in the middle of Advent, what gives you hope as you attend to your duties in the borderland you live in between the East and West?
there's a lot of hope. This recent conversation between you know, Pope Leo and Patriarch Bartholomew, the ecumenical patriarch. Um, I think this is a positive sign. Um, they're they're not falling for the contemporary polemics against each other. They have substantial teams of historians and theologians and joint ecumenical dialogues by real theologians who are supported by the official hierarchy, namely the hierarchy which the apostles appointed. Um, and they're oftentimes in support. of the perspective that we are very close to reunion. Um, my experience is that we are one people. My experience is that we all are in a place where we simply need to be faithful to the tradition entrusted to us. We need to live a holy and pious life. Um, we need good, solid liturgies, especially Roman Catholics. They need good, solid liturgies for their people. I think in doing that, we will draw more and more into unity. Um, uh, I would guess actually that's if I were Orthodox, and I've heard others say this before, that would actually be one of the leading causes of concern is the liturgy in the Latin Church. It really needs to be the traditional. I'm not saying Latin, but it needs to be traditional in the way that it's practiced. It needs to be beautified. There's a lot of sympathy there with the traditionalist movement in that regard. So I think as we move in that direction, we'll find more and more commonalities between churches. I would say that being a Byzantine Catholic who in seminary struggled deeply with wanting to really kind of be standoffish towards the Latin tradition, the more I've entered into it, the more I appreciate the Latin tradition and all that it has to offer the church. And so I support going back to our first conversation about the traditionalist. I deeply support those who want real tradition and want to return to the patristic sources. And I would say that that's the greatest thing that traditionalists could do for themselves is don't just return to the tradition of the Middle Ages. Let yourself go all the way back to the early Latin tradition. And once again, read Lactantius, read Jerome, read Augustine, go back and read Pope Gregory and Pope Leo and Tertullian, delve deeply into the Latin patristic tradition, and then open yourself up to the Eastern patristic tradition as you want to grow in your universal understanding of the faith. And I'm just absolutely positive that if more traditionalists would be open to reading the Eastern patristic tradition and the contemporary Eastern saints, they would have a whole world of joy opened up to them that they had never experienced before. And I see that happen all the time. All the time. I have traditionalists of the parish. I say, read this contemporary father. I know you're having a problem like thinking that the Orthodox Church is like somehow this like foreign agent. Just do me a favor, read Porphyrios, okay? Read this book, and then tell me that you have a problem with it. And inevitably they read it and they have so much joy. They have so much growth in their own Christian identity as they do so. So I would highly suggest that the traditionalists take a stab at it, really be open to the idea.
Well, and yeah, it seems like, especially now in Advent, it's good to, in a way, what we're talking about is like being humble instead of, open yourself up to the wider world of what Catholicism is.
Yep,
And
yep, absolutely.
all right. Well, thank you for coming on.
Yep, you got it, Spence, anytime.
Yeah, and thank you for all the work you do.
Well, blessed Advent fast to you, and also blessed Advent in the future.